Okay, thank you for that really generous introduction. And thank you for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here. Everything I'm going to say today begins from a problem which we find in this quote from Laurent Ballant. Intensity, by which he means the stalling and slowing of boredom, or the spark of hope, or a moment of fear, is a signal, not a truth. By which he means there is always some kind of gap between intensity, as I said, a spark of hope, a moment of boredom, and the stories we tell about that intensity. The way we enroll that intensity into a wider series of claims about some kind of social and cultural or political configuration and change. So everything I do today begins from the gap, the difference between considering intensity as a signal or a truth. I begin, though, with boredom. In response to a spate of suicides by workers in Foxconn City, China, between March and May in 2010, and amid intensified media attention and scrutiny focused on global inequalities, the Fair Labour Association conducted an audit of Apple's suppliers. What they found appeared to surprise them. So they were asking the question, what were the conditions which led to a spate of suicides? Before release of the official report, the president of the association, the Fair Labour Association, provided some initial reflections. He made a comparison with garment factories. He said, "I was very surprised when I walked onto the floor at Foxconn, how tranquil it appeared compared to a garment factory. So the problems are not the intensity and burnout and pressure cooker environment you have in a garment factory. It," referring to the suicides, "is more a function of monotony, of boredom, of alienation, perhaps." Now, despite the familiarity of this critique of factory labour, given the role, as we'll see as the lecture progresses, in claims of boredom in critiques of factory labour in the 20th century, the claim by the head of the Fair Labour Association was met with outrage by other labour organisations and activists. It was met with outrage. Partly this was because the role of employers in the Fair Labour Association meant that people suspected kind of downplaying of abuse. But the outrage was also because of the connection made between the event of suicide and something as seemingly trivial, as seemingly ubiquitous, as seemingly ordinary as boredom. Because who in this room hasn't felt bored at some point in their lives? Hopefully not during a lecture on boredom, but I'll come back to that problem in a second. It was considered an insult to the workers, to their lost lives, to connect suicide with something as apparently ubiquitous and as apparently trivial. And yet boredom is frequently invoked as a cause for seemingly violent, seemingly senseless actions, and very often connected to a critique of some kind of the affective costs or repercussions of life today. A 2018 report by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons, basically the body in the UK which inspects prison conditions, into a rise in violence and self-harm, but decline in suicides at the prison HMP Woodhill, linked that increase in violence and self-harm to a decline of activity regimes, with prisoners spending more time confined in their cells. The presence of an activity regime in prisons is one measure of a healthy prison. In other words, a healthy prison is one where there's an activity regime and there is less experience of a particular kind of confinement and less boredom. The report stated, the subsequent boredom and isolation increases the chance of disorder, reduces the opportunity for rehabilitation, and it can only increase the rates of reoffending. Again, a link then between boredom, seemingly trivial, and some kind of violent event. We find it elsewhere. A government review, UK government review, into local anti-knife crime initiatives identified, to quote, groups of young people hanging around and becoming bored and frustrated as a reason that young people got caught up in crime, with the hanging around seemingly consequence of the shrinking of the state and austerity. So given the complexity and kind of ambivalence of this relation between boredom and events of violence in some form or another, my talk asks a simple question. What is lost when boredom is present? And what is present when boredom is lost? Really simple question. And I want to stay with this question as a way to reflect on our modes of inquiry, principally critique, whereby we tell stories about the connection between affective life in some way or another. I'm using that as an umbrella term for now. We can have a conversation about different definitions of that if we wish and questions. Affective life and capitalism and changes in capitalism. So I want to use this question. I want to trace different claims about what's lost when boredom is present over the course of the 20th century and connect those into reflections on the relationship between changes in capitalism and changes in affective life. And I do this because boredom for me, frankly, boredom's like completely fascinating for me. And I've got no presumption it's going to be fascinating for anyone else, sadly, or not. But I find it a really strange and kind of interesting affect to stay with. So as we've seen, it's frequently invoked as a cause for disruptive events. It's frequently linked with frustration, isolation, alienation, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, simultaneously, it's frequently dismissed. It's naturalized as a trivial, almost endemic feature of all of human life. Because again, who in this room has not felt bored at some point? So the stasis and stall of boredom may appear initially to lack the intensity, the obvious harm and damage of some of the other affects that are increasingly becoming central to our attempt to diagnose contemporary capitalism. Consider how loneliness or burnout, for example, have become public matters of concern in the midst of a kind of aesthetic and social critique of the isolations and the frenzies of neoliberal capitalism. Or think how various strong moods are invoked as causes of contemporary events and political changes post the financial crisis. Racialized resentment driving the emergence of various populisms of the right, for example. A feeling of being left behind. The outrage that circulates online. Boredom doesn't seem to quite fit with those stories of strong affect. And yet if we slow down and pay attention, we find that claims about boredom as a kind of contemporary condition or about bored subjects surfaced throughout attempts to diagnose the contemporary condition. Intensifications of online outrage supposedly interrupt the almost but not quite boredom of scrolling. Boredom settles in peripheral places, supposedly left behind. It exists as a felt consequence of austerity, in prisons, and other places where services have contracted. It can be a symptom of loneliness and burnout. So staying with boredom then might teach us a little about what is missing today, about what's lost when boredom is present. But this requires, before I begin to tell a set of stories about the relationship between affect and capitalism through boredom, requires we pause for a moment and think a little bit about what kind of relation or event boredom is. My starting point here, and I absolutely love his work, is a quote by a psychoanalyst called Adam Phillips. And it helps us kind of deepen our starting reflections on this problem of what is missing when boredom is present. Echoing Tolstoy's formulation of boredom as, to quote, desire seeking desire, Phillips describes boredom as a wish for desire. A wish for desire. Now, I'll elaborate on what is meant by this in a moment. And we should note that Phillips offers quite a celebratory account of boredom. He's basically part of a tradition which sees because boredom involves a detachment from the thing that bores you, it opens up a space or a moment of creativity. In other words, he makes a strong argument for the possibility of boredom as being the kind of moment before creativity. So his is a particular account of boredom. It's kind of celebratory in tone. It's not the boredom of prisons or factories without the possibility of escape. But he elaborates on this phrase, the wish for a desire, in a way that's always resonated. Boredom for him is the experience of waiting for the experience of anticipation. So boredom is a kind of waiting, but what are you waiting for when you're bored? What you're waiting for is to re-experience anticipation, re-experience the presence of the future in the present. So what is missing when boredom is present is the experience of anticipation. More precisely, the presence of a possible future event that may be felt through a range of anticipatory affects, from dread to hope, from fear to excitement. Boredom settles when events, or rather that possibility the events bring, are absent. Whether it be an event of being interested by a lecture, an event of being moved by a piece of art, whatever it might be, boredom is present when events are absent. So staying with boredom, tracking its different manifestations, might teach us then about the unequal distribution of eventfulness in contemporary lives. But this kind of emphasis on the flatness of boredom, on the absence of the feeling of anticipation, only goes so far to kind of teaching us how and why boredom matters. We also have to consider, what does boredom do to the relations between bodies in a situation? So, pause for a moment and consider the situation of boredom. What does it do to our relations with that which bores when we're bored? What does boredom enact? Again, it's a quote I love from John Luke Marion. He says, "Boredom does not evaluate, does not affirm, does not love." Unlike love, understood as an attunement to singularity, to the singularity of an other, boredom is indifferent. The particular qualities that make something singular are lost. A piece of music blurs into the background with other pieces of music. You switch off from a lecture. As time stills and space slows, boredom involves a practice of detachment, a kind of bodily judgment born through discernment and evaluation. And it's this turning away from the thing which bores, which have been at the heart of debates for centuries about the ethics of boredom, okay? And debates about the compromised kind of possibilities of boredom. So consider, in this kind of, when we think about boredom as a turning away, a practice of detachment from something. Give a brief example, acedia, considered to be one of the precursors to boredom, along with tedium vitae, melancholy, and so on. So acedia is typically kind of understood as boredom with spiritual rituals. So boredom with spiritual devotion and the various practices which enable spiritual devotion. And acedia was a sin, the worst sin. And it was a sin because it involved the failure to discern God. Because you detached, you turned away. And we can see here how kind of figures who are turning away from that devotion. So here, boredom is subject, or a kind of boredom, is subject to a critique because of its ethics of detachment. We could compare with recent reflections in the UK about the UK's failure to address the atrocity of Grenfell Tower, the Grenfell Tower fire a couple of years ago. A political commentator, Gary Young, identifies a collective boredom as an ethical and political failure, a source of shame, to quote. He says, "It's not that we don't see injustice or cannot comprehend it. It's that we apparently get bored by it." So he identifies the boredom with injustice, a turning away from it, as an ethical and political failure. But at the same time, it's exactly this turning away from a phenomena that is central to the relation that is boredom, that has been central to the valorization of boredom as a kind of as the precursor to creativity. Boredom being that which initiates new possibilities. So, on boredom. Staying with boredom then does not only teach us about how life stalls, how eventfulness is unevenly distributed, but it also teaches us about how our detachments are organised. It teaches us about what we yearn for. It teaches us about what we hope to exit. Because of course, boredom always involves an exit from the thing which you detach from. Whether this is in the most mundane ways of just daydreaming in an ordinary situation. So, in the remaining kind of 30 minutes or so of the lecture, I want to talk then about, if we think about boredom as involving a kind of geography of stalling and detaching and yearning for something better and exiting situations, I want to think about changes in this kind of like desire for a desire, changes in this feeling of waiting for anticipation, in relation to changes in capitalism. Now, this is not a simple task, very obviously, and it's not a simple task because of two initial problems. First of all, the presumption that there are a plurality of boredoms, number one. And this obviously complicates my initial attempt to understand boredom as of waiting for the experience of anticipation. But let's presume to begin with that there are multiple boredoms. Boredom is not a single thing. There are multiple types or forms of boredom. And secondly, how then do we connect up multiple boredoms of different types and forms to the varieties of capitalism, or more precisely, the different practices and apparatus that make up capitalism? So what I'm in the midst of doing at the minute is the very early stages of writing a book on boredom in the 20th century. Trying to use boredom as a case for how we think about the relation between affective life and some kind of social political condition and kind of system here, capitalism. And what I'm doing basically currently is listening to stories of everyday boredom. And kind of trying to track where boredom shows up in public debate and in the context of people's everyday lives. So my kind of method initially is to pay, if you like, an excessive amount of interest to the phenomena of boredom. And some members of the audience will note the irony in doing that. You pay attention to the thing which involves turning away. You find kind of like excessive amounts of meaning and frankly like joy and interest. I've got a very tragic life. Joy and interest in a thing which involves the stilling and slowing of life. Now I'll come back to the kind of methodological contradictions in that move in conclusion and perhaps in questions as well about what's lost when you're interested in a phenomena that involves the absence of interest. But anyway. All I want to do today, because obviously that's like a little bit too much to do in a lecture, and also I've got kind of like very many kind of like words and kind of like observations on boredom. Too much for today. Instead, what I want to do is identify a series of scenes over the course of the 20th century where boredom has shown up as a kind of matter of public concern. To begin with, in relation to critiques of Fordism, particularly in the UK, North America. Secondly, claims about what's happened to boredom today. If kind of like, however you designate our current kind of varieties of capitalism, if there has been some kind of transition or transformation or redeployment of elements of Fordism, how then do you tell a different story about the link between boredom and contemporary capitalism? And then my final scene is the critical, I'd argue, role of boredom in contemporary populism, illustrated through Brexit in the UK and Donald Trump. So different moments, different scenes over the course of the kind of long 20th century, I guess you might want to call it, where boredom becomes a kind of matter of public concern. And I want to do this going back to that very first quote I began with, about that gap between intensity. Intensity is a signal, not a truth. In other words, there's always work to be done to enroll any kind of affect or emotion into a story about the contemporary. So the first kind of scene, Fordist consumer culture, the critique of. In 1977, year of my birth, the Clash, unrelated event, Clash released London's Burning. The lyrics are incongruous, burning and boredom together. They go like this. Yeah, the lyrics are kind of like shouted, and like occasionally when I'm lecturing kind of like undergraduates, I might actually shout the lyrics to like wake them up, but I'm not going to do that now. That's like too embarrassing, and it's been video recorded. But the key thing here is how the kind of centre of the sort of metropolitan centre, and London here just kind of like stands in for any kind of large metropolitan centre, really. A critique of life at the very centre of the Fordist consumer culture is organised around a claim about boredom. And it's organised around a claim about boredom which makes clear the intensity of that feeling of boredom. London is burning with boredom. And of course, this is a critique of the monotony of a life divided into stable work and compensatory leisure, a classic kind of Fordist formation. The lyrics and energy of the song are but one example of a kind of countercultural protest against boredom, an attempt to subvert and overturn the practices and scenes of boredom that, as Grail Marcuse demonstrates, ties punk with the situationalists in a period of oppositional kind of energy and optimism. This counter-formation, organised in part by what Malcolm McLaren named as a politics of boredom, provides one answer to my question of what is lost when boredom is present. The answer here, by the punks and others, is a strong one. In many ways uncharacteristic of the kind of sometimes mocking talk that occasionally makes the presence of boredom into a matter of concern today. Boredom is a kind of living death, felt equally and tragically across work and leisure, despite, in some ways, the promises of leisure. The artwork, very famous artwork for the Sex Pistols, two destinations only, nowhere or boredom. The refrain of feminist punk band The Slits' Boredom kind of captures almost the anguish that surrounds the claim about boredom here. How could anyone survive this boring life? Exemplary what the founding member of the Slits, Viv Albertine, described in a memoir as a horror of boredom that coursed through the energies of punk. So this is one occasion where boredom became a kind of matter of a certain kind of countercultural public concern, and it's linked to a claim that what is missing in Fordist consumer culture is life itself, is meaning. Boredom teaches us, or so the argument goes, that life under Fordist consumer culture is deadened. Boredom becomes both a symptom and a sign of that deadening. And we find this claim about boredom exists in other kind of work that at various points is trying to produce a kind of combination of a kind of social and aesthetic critique of that form of capitalism. So Adorno's essay on free time might be familiar to some of you. So Adorno argues against the idea of free time as a kind of, to quote, oasis of unmediated life. And in what is quite an entertaining discussion, it kind of moves from a really strong critique of sunbathing, like he hates sunbathing, and camping. I'm with him on camping. Actually, I'm with him on sunbathing as well. Like, who wants to do these things, honestly? He ties boredom to a complex mixture of powerlessness and what he calls the defamation of the imagination. But boredom had, of course, regularly surfaced in other critiques of the Fordist formation, in ways that remind us of, if you might call, the unequal distributions of boredom. So boredom's there in that countercultural critique, but it's there at other moments, and it's there in other ways of trying to diagnose the problems of Fordism. And it reminds us of the link between boredom and different forms of power. So we might recall the narrator in Saul Bellow's Humboldt's Gift, who describes boredom as a kind of pain caused by unused powers. The pain of wasted possibilities or talents, accompanied by expectations of the optimum utilization of capacities. Later and very simply, the narrator claims, power is the power to impose boredom, to command stasis, to combine this stasis with anguish. So there's other scenes and occasions, in addition to the punks, where this critique of boredom and its links to power emerges. One of them is actually amongst representatives of industry, amongst factory owners, who basically begin to identify a kind of protest against boredom by assembly workers, particularly in North America from the mid-60s onwards, and the ways in which boredom and exhaustion was becoming a problem for retention and productivity. Boredom became links to absenteeism, to poor work, to strikes, to sabotage, and various ways of measuring the boredom proneness of workers and kind of pathologizing that proneness emerged, as well as attempts to motivate, attempts to make work more fulfilling, and various other kind of compensatory activities. So you've got this kind of, you could tell a convincing story, I think, which effectively says a critique of boredom emerges in this kind of countercultural formation, and then begins to kind of like emerge at other points, and becomes, if you like, a problem for governance. It's a problem, the boredom of the workers is a problem for assembly line, effectively like management to deal with. But of course, again, that's not the only scene where boredom emerges in relation to this kind of formation of Fordism. It's there also in critiques of the gendered division of labour under Fordism, as Betty Friedan famously named the problem with no name. She offered a critique of, if you like, the unequal gendered division of boredom. Amongst other symptoms of what she termed the problem with no name were a feeling of desperation, a yearning for something more. She describes a terrible tiredness amongst the women she spoke to in The Feminine Mystique, or for the book, sorry, The Feminine Mystique, which may be, to quote her, due to boredom. Now, interestingly, what crosses between these different ways in which boredom becomes a problem and a concern is the kind of intimacy between promises of a good life and a repetitive, inert time, which not only exhausts but impoverishes experience. For some management, in relation to the assembly line, boredom becomes a problem to be solved, or rather the escape attempts that boredom prompts becomes problems to be managed. We can also think of how boredom surfaces a problem across other sites of constraint here. It's not only the assembly line. Activity regimes in prisons and nursing homes being the kind of most obvious current example where boredom is a problem to be governed. There's a whole industry in relation to care homes, basically, which are all about alleviating the boredom of residents in care homes. So you have a kind of capitalization of the desire to exit boredom. So instead of a kind of crisis ordinariness, to use Ballant's term, what you have critiqued here in relation to Fordism is a kind of too ordinary ordinariness, a life without experience. This is a critique, though, predominantly focused on the subjects who are at the centre of that formation and remain in proximity to its fantasies and its promises. We could think to remind ourselves of the unequal distribution of boredoms in other ways, of Bell Hooks's opening in the book Feminist Theory, From Margin to Centre, where she particularises the bored female subject of Friedan's The Problem That Has No Name. To quote, Friedman's famous phrase, "the problem that has no name," often quoted to describe the condition of women in this society, actually refer to the plight of a select group of college-educated, middle and upper-class women, married, white women, housewives bored with leisure, with the home, with children, with buying products, and wanted more out of life. So Hux's critique reminds us that this boredom, and the kind of public concern which surrounded it, the boredom of kind of ordinariness, is the boredom very much of those at the centre of a racialised formation of capitalism. We can read Hux's critique alongside Majumdar's work on the British Empire to further particularise the boredom of punks, as well as pluralise our discussion of the relations between boredom and capitalist apparatuses and practices. In what's a stunning work, he tracks in modernist literature what he terms, and I quote, "a colonial yearning for the excitement and eventfulness of the metropolis that crosses administrators and subjects." But he stresses a difference in kind between these boredoms against the background of what he calls the oppressive banalisation of everyday life on the margins of empire and the iterative banality of colonial rule. Here we see hints, and perhaps we can give no more than that, of how boredom surfaces in relation to a problem of the non-occurrence of the future, which again, in Majumdar's terms, what is thwarted in different ways is the spatial transcendence of the immediate and the temporal transcendence of the everyday. Boredom is, instead, and I quote, "a symptom of the impoverishment of lives within the ideological and material reality of colonial domination." So, my question now then is, what has happened to the boredom of ordinariness? The boredom of inert time, a boredom which emerged from a formation organised around a gender division of labour, in which leisure compensated for stable work. What's happened to this boredom? Has it become residual, and a new or different kind of boredom emerged in the context of a shift from the kind of pain of ordinariness to what Laurent Ballant terms crisis ordinariness? How, to put it differently, do we situate boredom in relation to today's varieties of capitalism, especially as the kind of flatness of boredom doesn't quite fit with the stories told about the frenzies of neoliberal capitalism and its violences? Even though boredom appears to also envelope many of the events that have emerged as a consequence of some of the pains and frustrations of that formation of capitalism. Many of the events that kind of like mark our contemporary political moment seem to involve this kind of like strange mixture of the dramatic and boring, where the two are intimate with one another, kind of spiral in and out in relation to one another. Think of Brexit in the UK, where the dramatic and the boring coexisted during the kind of impasse between referendum result and some form of resolution. So what's become of boredom today? There's boredom, as well as kind of enveloping those events. It also plays out in particular kind of debates. Think about the debates around the automation of labour, the kind of replacement of various forms of human labour through various robotic technologies, and how in one articulation of that debate, what is promised is an exit from the boredom of certain kinds of work. So boredom's still there. But before speculating on these questions of what's happened to boredom today, has it changed? Have we lost a certain kind of boredom? I want to reflect on the kind of story I've told so far about boredom. How I've made boredom as a particular signal into a certain kind of truth about Fordist capitalism. Here, the boredom of other people has become a source of kind of indignation and fuels a particular genre through which critiques have been offered of capitalism. Capitalism is primarily understood in the story so far as an occasion for inauthenticity and disenchantment. Boredom, in short, has typically, over the course of the 20th century, been enrolled in what Balansky and Chapello term the artistic critique of capitalism. invoked as symptomatic of a kind of crisis in the forms of meaning available to people in their everyday lives. And of course, this critique of capitalism has had a kind of artistic dimension to it over the course of the 20th century. There's a whole genre dedicated to dramatizing and displaying and kind of reworking this critique of monotony and tedium. Think, for example, of how this is a series of stills from the book Boring Postcards by the British photographer Martin Parr. And what Martin Parr does is he identifies basically a series of scenes from post-war British life. In particular, what one might call, but they're clearly not, the kind of non-places of 20th century modernity, hotel rooms, retail parks, so on. And he dramatizes the monotony and the tedium of daily life. Now, of course, in dramatizing the monotony and tedium of daily life, by paying an excessive amount of interest, he finds a kind of wonder in the ordinary. You know, it's a very typical kind of aesthetic strategy in relation to everyday life. You pay a huge amount of attention to that which is seemingly trivial, and in doing so, you reveal its kind of hidden in plain sight wonder. And so Parr's part of a kind of counter tradition that finds mystery in tedium, finds kind of meaning in ordinariness. But of course, in this critique, which Parr kind of exemplifies and kind of plays with, and here we could think about the links between this image. This is from a series called Bored Couples. This image and that image of acedia, of people turning away from each other in spiritual practice. How a couple here turn away from each other. So it's kind of, again, staging that question of what's the ethics of detachment? What's the ethics of turning away from another through the action of boredom? If anyone's ever been bored with a partner, think about something different now. Okay, but this critique of boredom over the course of, in relation to Fordism, it's actually a very familiar story about modernity. It's a very familiar story which has been central to reflections on boredom since the term was first used. In English language, it's typically dated to the mid-19th century, 1852, in Dickens' Bleak House. And the stories told about boredom is that boredom is an effect of all those processes that we identify with modernity. So boredom is an effect of individualization. So as soon as we presume we have the right not to be bored, as soon as we presume that we are unique individuals who should be interested by the world out there, then boredom emerges. Boredom gets connected to the stories about rationalization of experience, about standardization of experience. Whatever story is told about modernity, boredom gets enrolled as symptom of. So in some ways, everything I've said in the first half about the punks and others and their critique of boredom in relation to Fordism, all they're really doing is reiterating with a difference, a long-term critique of modernity, really. So it's a particular kind of story. Put simply, our very capacity to say, I'm bored, or it's boring, to make a judgment of something or someone else is boring, and to presume that the fault lies with the thing which bores, rather than ourselves. That very capacity is, so the argument goes, a way we are still and have always been modern. It's one of the ways in which we have learned to practice a kind of ordinary discernment that produces ourselves as unique subjects. So, the story about Fordism and boredom reiterates a story about modernity, and it reiterates the same form of that story. Boredom is a secondary cause of a series of processes that you can pre-identify. And we could, of course, tell something like a similar story today about what's happened with boredom. It'd be perhaps a more confused one because of the kind of indistinction between ordinariness and crisis that we see in various ways today. But if the problem in Fordism was the proximity of emptiness to good life fantasies, the way that even leisure was boring, even that which was supposed to compensate for stable work, even leisure was boring, The problem today appears to be that a certain form of boredom is disappearing, whilst another is emerging. If as empty time, as the time of doing nothing, becomes scarce in the midst of the changes that go under the name of precarity in particular. So reprising fears of kind of cognitive and bodily overload that are periodically played out throughout modernity, and mixing with a kind of digital paranoia about the changes to the human sensorium that follow from our immersion in digital technologies. Critics claim today that digital media generate a particular kind of affective malaise, characterized by a perpetual, non-stop restlessness and a kind of unease, but mixed together with an almost kind of pre-boredom, never quite boredom, because you're always scrolling or clicking or connecting before you can ever actually become bored. So the claim goes. And these anxieties of, if you like, the loss of boredom, the emergence of a kind of pre-boredom, these anxieties play out most intensely today around the figure of the no longer bored child. A child who is so distracted, so caught up in the information flows and ecologies to be able to hold their attention. Stands in for a broader concern about the absence of boredom today. Not its presence, as in the stories of Fordist capitalism, but the problem today is boredom is too absent. But of course, this story itself only repeats a long, well-established stories about the distracted subjects of modernity, their capacities for self-reflection and critiques fragmented by technologies. So we reach a kind of impasse. The question is boredom too present today or too absent? The kind of argument goes that boredom is now functional for a particular kind of digital capitalism. It's a necessary affective condition for an attention economy organised around the logic of the update, but at the same time, boredom is absent, in the sense that what exists is the anticipation of boredom, or more precisely, the anticipation of the experience of waiting for the experience of anticipation, to go back to the initial definition of boredom that I put at the start. The claim critiques like Mark Fisher have offered is that we're both deeply bored in relation to this attention economy, but somehow never quite feel boredom. And the economic practices that surround boredom today produce this kind of doubleness. Boredom is the ever-present threat that must be countered to accumulate attention capital. Think of how something like user interface design uses gamification, humour, other technologies to create memorable experiences that hold a user's presence. I don't think this is going to work. This is just an example of gamification to basically hold attention. So on the one hand, boredom is a threat. Boredom is something which the detachment, the exit that accompanies boredom is a threat. If what you need to accumulate is the attention of users and consumers. But the story is a little bit more complicated because, of course, boredom is intentionally produced to move and shift our attention. Think, for example, about how the terms and conditions sections surrounding our data usage are made intentionally boring by designers so that we detach from them quickly, so we don't pay attention to where our data is going, how our data is used. Think about how video game designers, particular online mobile video games, make certain parts of the games deliberately boring so as to encourage in-game spending. So boredom is not only the threat that needs to be alleviated to hold attention. Boredom is also that which must be cultivated to move our attention in just the right way, or to produce certain kinds of actions. So it's a complicated question, the relation between boredom and capital. Talk more about that later. But again, let's pause and consider the form and content of this critique before I move on to the final section in the last 5 minutes on populism. What we've got here is really another iteration of the artistic critique of capitalism that we saw in relation to Fordism. The claim about Fordism was there is something about the organisation of life into stable work and compensatory leisure that produces a kind of deadened experience. It's not necessarily a social critique of capitalism for the inequality, it's a critique on the level of experience, that there is something wrong about boredom. There is something wrong about a society that produces that degree of boredom. Now here, in relation to today's digital capitalism, you effectively have the same form of critique. It's an artistic critique of digital capitalism, which says, again, there is something wrong about a society which produces the particular kind of pre-boredom, the particular kind of not yet but always potentially present boredom that we see harnessed, produced, deliberately moved away from in relation to digital capitalism today. And again, it focuses on the subjects who are at the very centre of this formation, those who are invested in digital capitalism, its promises and its practices. Now here we get into complicated territory of the normative basis for a critique of experience. Now in some ways the normative critique in relation to the boredom of Fordism was clear. Boredom was to be replaced by joy and fun. Joy and fun positively valued, boredom negatively valued. Here it's more complicated in relation to today's digital capitalism. And in part because of a series of distinctions that are made between forms of boredom. In a twist, the presumption is that today that something is lost when boredom is absent. So when boredom is replaced by the scroll, boredom is replaced by the click, boredom is replaced by the logic of the update, something is missing. Creativity or respite. So what you have, because of this ambivalent status of boredom today, are various attempts to capitalise on a desire for boredom, a desire for empty time. Because there's a presumption that, and here again, repeating another story told about boredom, presumption that boredom, because it detaches, leads to creativity. Boredom ushers in the possibility of something new, something different. So on the one hand, cultivating bored subjects is advocated and valorised as a way of enhancing productivity, being linked to mind-wandering, daydreaming, other forms of creative practices. So boredom has a kind of promise as an economic resource, if you like, in the midst of attempts to develop human capital. The book from the guy called Cal Newport here, Deep Work, is, this quote is so ridiculous, I always like to put it up. It's the idea of that that a practice of productivity to produce the kind of bodily capacities and actions necessary for this kind of capitalism and its forms of work is to temporarily grid yourself some boredom. So boredom is harnessed into a kind of like an attempt to produce productive subjects. Say more about the kind of work this is necessary for. But on the other hand, boredom is also valorised and in a kind of contradiction to this, because how it signals a capacity to step outside a kind of frenzied, speeded up present, to stop and slow down. Think of the idea of kind of digital detox, of switching off devices, of stepping away from the intensity of the flows of information, and how the important place of boredom as an experience that emerges once you step outside the flow of information, and how that's increasingly valorised. In fact, a whole series of kind of good life fantasies are kind of emerging around a life which has the capacity for boredom again. Now, of course, what we see here in the kind of like the fantasy of a life with boredom is a whole complicated series of questions about, is boredom a good thing or a bad thing? What kinds of boredoms are to be valorised? What kinds of boredoms aren't? So my final kind of comments for 5 minutes or so. I think we live in a situation today where there's an ambivalence that surrounds boredom. Boredom is kind of like at the centre of a series of contradictory formations around the question of what is a good life to be led. Is boredom the anecdote to demands on our attention, and should it be welcomed and cultivated? as a kind of ordinary practice of skepticism and detachment. If you like, boredom as the kind of democratization of skepticism, let's say. We should all be more bored by the pronouncements of those in power, for example. Or is boredom, or as well, is boredom symptomatic of the latest atrophy of experience that capital practices and forms on the one hand promise salvation from, but on the other hand end up reproducing? In short, is boredom too absent or too present today? What I want to do is stay with this ambiguity and the story of a transition so far from Fordist boredom to the loss of boredom by finishing with a series of high-profile examples of the politics of boredom today, in particular in relation to the emergence of right-wing populism. During a debate between Democratic presidential candidates on the 26th of June 2019, Donald Trump sent out a single tweet, retweeted at the time I wrote this, more than 79,000 times, and liked over 325,000 times. Not that those figures necessarily mean anything at all. Boring. The tweet and reactions to it and interactions with it became another quasi or pseudo event in a discontinuous flow of other, almost but not quite, events. And the judgment of others as boring is something that Trump and other popularists in North America and the UK regularly do. And of course, this reminds us that boredom is always a matter of division. It always produces a division between being bored and not being bored, between those who bore and those who are interesting. It's always a matter of division. And of course, the statement here, as with so many of Trump's other tweets, generated circuits of kind of self-reinforcing, amplifying outrage. So not only, though, do popularists regularly claim their opponents are boring, or claim some features of liberal democratic politics are boring, their supporters regularly praise them for making politics fun and joyful once more. Amongst debate about what the American midterm elections meant a couple of years ago, Trump again professed he enjoyed them. The results didn't necessarily matter. What mattered was that the midterms weren't boring anymore. So a kind of critique of boredom and this valorization of enjoyment and fun can be found throughout popularist practices, in particular on the right. We might think, for example, of how a critique of bureaucracy, with its feeling of kind of obstructed agency, with the boredom of the experience of bureaucracy, was absolutely central to anti-EU feeling in the UK. This association of the EU with the everyday experience of time stilling, space slowing, was critical to anti-EU feeling. It was something composed over decades. Of course, that reactivated various forms of state phobia, which have been right at the heart of neoliberalism since the kind of like late 1970s. So we could kind of be provocative and say the populist right has mobilised the punk's critique of boredom. But they've attached kind of like boredom to the institutions and forms of liberal democracy. This injection of a kind of anti-boredom disposition to political scenes speaks partly to the complex affective politics of today's populism, where racialised resentments coexist with affects we're a little less used to diagnosing. So here, boredom and the boredom that popularists claim of their opponents links to the really troubling role of fun in contemporary right-wing politics. Now, of course, kind of fun is a very contradictory, dubious thing. Fun is always linked to the kind of like the potential violence of excess, dangerous fun, or the idea of having fun at someone else's expense. A kind of violent fun that rebels in stage and express. We could also think, just as a kind of almost finishing point, as an aside, about how the politics of the left and the centre, again in North America and in the UK, I'm talking about predominantly here, are really explicitly trying to reclaim fun, and also perform a kind of anti-boredom disposition in their politics thinking of ideas in the UK on left circles around acid communism, around pleasure politics. The Liberal Democrats' slogan, bollocks to Brexit. Again, this same attempt to disrupt indifference, attempt to not be boring, and how that's been martialised by different political formations. Okay, some final comments in conclusion. So as I said, in the background to this paper has been a problem. How to practice a critique of an affective or emotional state like boredom in a manner that keeps open the gap between signal and truth. That says for a moment that we don't know quite what is happening today around something like boredom. Instead, to try and stay with the different manifestations of boredom, to tell other stories about affective life today. And what I've tried to do, just really simply, is pay a kind of excessive amount of interest to boredom, to try and connect it, on the one hand, to an emerging critique of Fordism, whilst at the same time wondering about the contradictory ways in which it exists as both, if you like, promise and threat today. There's supposedly too much and not enough boredom simultaneously. But of course, conceptually, you might have noticed, when I've been talking about boredom, it is already multiple things. So it is at once a feeling, the expression of a subject, I'm bored, you're bored, a genre of aesthetic judgment, that's a boring piece of artwork, the symptom of something, a cause for a violent action, a background that finds expression in something else, a governance problem. Boredom is all of these things simultaneously, so any story about boredom and capitalism needs to think about transformations in these things. So I want to end with a series of speculations about the different kinds of boredoms that may exist today. I want to end then with what is really a beginning, the beginning of a much wider research project, a kind of geography of stalling and yearning, underpinned by a claim that something about the experience of empty time today, something about it today is changing. So perhaps these and other boredoms have emerged, replacing or coexisting with Fordist boredom. But of course, researching boredom isn't easy. How do you pay attention to something which attempts to constantly slides away from attention? And on these kind of methodological notes, I'll finish. Thank you for listening.